Hello everyone, and welcome to your next literature video. Mrs. Krivak did such a nice job with her first one. I'm hoping I can live up to that. We are going to be getting into poetry this week, and this first Thursday I want us to focus a little bit on the elements of poetry and understanding it as a form of literature. I asked you to do an activity this week where you wrote down some thoughts and some notes on what is poetry. If I had to guess some of the things that you wrote down, I would assume that maybe you put things like words that rhyme, maybe a form of literature, or maybe even you would put something where you can just write whatever you want and it's okay, it's considered a poem. Or maybe you wrote that it's all about feelings, that people write poetry when they want to write about their feelings. And there are certainly some things in those comments that would be true, but what I'm hoping you'll understand by the end of this is that poetry is a really complex and structured kind of writing, and that there are so many cool things you can do within a structure once you understand it. And I'm hoping that you won't look at poetry quite the same way the next time you read it once you realize what some of the writers of poetry do as they write and create those pieces. So the four elements that we're going to focus on today that I'd like you to understand about a poem are stanzas, meter, different poetic devices, some of which you already know, and rhyme scheme. And that's what I'm going to focus on most today. Next week, the following Thursday on the 16th, we're going to be looking at a poem called Pioneers, O Pioneers. And I'm using this example in here because Mrs. Krivak set it up so well. And I want you to see that for a stanza is basically a section of a poem. So it is going to be in here just in the same way that when you read a book or an article, you might see paragraphs blocked out. So when you have a section of a poem called a stanza, there is usually something that the author is doing within that stanza with their rhyme scheme or with an image that they're creating. So you almost read them in small chunks throughout the poem. Meter is really getting into kind of the sound of the writing as you read it aloud. And one of the things that I hope you experienced when you read The Eagle, both to yourself and then silently, and you heard the words out loud, I hope you could hear that there was just a whole different experience to hearing the rhythm of the words and the way that they sound and the pace. And if you're interested, you could always go back and do that again and try reading it with different emphasis. It almost changes the whole feel of the piece that you're reading. So when we look at meter, we look at what's stressed and unstressed on the syllables of the words as we read through the lines of the poem. The stressed syllables tend to be longer and the unstressed shorter. So if you can see the notation up here, those slashes are showing you the stressed syllables, and then the U's are showing the unstressed. So if I'm reading this poem, I'm saying, "Come, my tan-faced children. Follow well in order, get your weapons ready." So it's not a very distinct difference, but you can hear a little bit based on how I'm sort of trying to raise the volume a little bit or the emphasis, that there will be a different rhythm to how you read things. Poetic devices, these are some other things that you guys have already learned about when you're writing in different types of literature. So if we look at this first line, we must march, my darlings. We must bear the brunt of danger. You see something happening there that is a writing technique, and I'm going to ask somebody to guess it. Oh, I think Isaac is going to guess right now. Yes, Isaac? Oh, that's excellent. Isn't Isaac a genius, everyone? Yes, it is alliteration. Yes, alliteration. You have learned these. All right, how about the next sentence? Let's look at the bolded word here and see if someone else can take a guess. Soon I hear you come warbling. Soon you rise and tramp amid us. Oh my goodness, Josh could hardly wait for me to finish. Yes, Josh, that is correct. Warbling is onomatopoeia, right, where the word actually sounds like the actual sound that it makes. Excellent job. All right, and for the last one, let's see if we can come up with this poetic device or writing technique. From the peaks gigantic, from the great Sierras and the high plateaus. Oh yes, and Lizzie was right on that. Imagery, correct. That is another different device that you've learned about in writing that you will find in poems. Good job, guys. There are two new ones that you're going to learn this week as well. One is called consonants, which is repeated consonant sounds, usually within the same line. So as you look at this line here, you can see that the ND sound is what's repeating. Do they droop and end their lesson, wearied over there beyond the seas? So the author is very intentionally using that sound, repeating it within a line to create kind of a rhythm for you. Assonance, or repeated vowel sounds, is another technique that you can use. When you look at this last line, it's a little hard to see where the bold is, but the I in divided and the I in united is really stressing that long I sound. So when you read the line, we hear, never must you be divided. In our ranks you move united. And you don't really think about that, right? When you just read the poem, you read it, you hear the flow, and you think, gosh, that just kind of has a rhythm and it rolls off my tongue. There's a reason that that happens, and it's actually something very intentional that the author is doing using these different poetic devices. Rhyme scheme is probably something that you're the most familiar with if you know anything about poetry, but it's very important to the structure of the poem, and it includes things like the meter, the length of the phrase or the length of the lines maybe that you are trying to repeat, and the actual rhythm of the poem. In some ways, I think that rhyme scheme can be a lot like music, and I know that we have a lot of musicians in our group, people who like to drum or play the cello or play the piano or other instruments, and you've probably learned that when you do things with your musical technique, you can really change the flow of a piece, the tempo of the piece, and even the emotion that someone has when they listen to it. Poetry is very similar to music in that way. So rhyme scheme can be used to create balance, right? To keep things kind of steady and even. It can relieve tension, right? So if something is really intense as you're reading, you can use this other techniques to kind of soften it. If you're using similar soft sounds, like I just did there with alliteration, you tend to feel a little calmer. You can manage the flow of how the poem goes. You can create a rhythm, and you can also highlight important ideas by how you break those things out in the line format. And we may get into some of that more next week. But basically what I want you to understand is that your rhyme scheme can really impact the flow and the tenor of the poem that you write. So now what I'd like to do is take a look at a few rhyme schemes, and I'll share a few fun poems with you, and just start getting a feel for what is happening when you read a piece of poetry. One of the most common rhyme schemes is called alternate rhyme. It's also known as the A-B rhyme scheme. And it rhymes with its first and third lines rhyming, the second and fourth lines rhyming, and then in the next stanza where you see like the C-D, again, the first and third line rhyme, the second and fourth line rhyme, but they can be completely different words than what were in the first stanza. So let's just look at an example. This one I picked out purely because it related to American history. It's not one I've ever heard before, but I thought it fit. And this is just the very first stanza. So it says, a nation's strength. What makes a nation's pillars high and its foundations strong? What makes it mighty to defy the foes that round it throng? And so as you look, you can see line 1 and 3, high and defy, rhyme, and lines 2 and 4, strong and throng, rhyme. And if you want to look up a nation's strength, you can read the rest of this poem and you'll see that each stanza continues on with that rhyme scheme. Monorhyme is probably not a term many of us have heard before, but it is a poem in which every line uses the exact same rhyming word. Okay, so usually these poems tend to be shorter because it's pretty hard to write, a 36-line poem and have a word that will rhyme perfectly all the way through. Though if anyone does that, I would really be impressed and I would love to read that poem. So with Charlie's permission, I've written a short 5-line poem or 6-line poem that I am writing in monorhyme about Charlie. It's called A Boy Named Charlie, appropriately. I knew a boy named Charlie. He loved to ride his Harley and play with his dog Carly. On Thursdays, he ate barley and left his hair all snarly. He thought he looked quite gnarly. And if you don't know what gnarly means, ask your parents, and they will laugh, and they will shake their heads, and they will think about the 90s. All right, the third type of rhyme scheme is called a couplet. Two-line stanzas with an AA rhyme scheme. So this often appears when you have a longer poem as AA, the first two lines end with the same rhyming word, BB, then the third and fourth would end with the same rhyming word, CC, DD, etc. You know some poems like this from when you were young, such as Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again, right? Twinkle, twinkle, little star would be another example of these. Here's one a little longer that's kind of a cool poem. It's called A Captive. Once I dive into these pages, I may not come out for ages. Books have powers over me. Inside a book, I am not free. I am a prisoner in a land of print on paper in my hand. But do not worry, do not fear. I am a happy captive here. As you look at this, you can see there are actually 4 different sets of rhyming words, right? Our couplets, and the last 2 words are rhyming within each couplet. Pages, ages, me, free, land, hand, fear, and here. Triplets are very similar to a couplet, and they would use a rhyme scheme where 3 lines in a row end with a similar rhyming word. The eagle, which you've already all read, because I'm sure everyone listened to my instructions and did everything exactly in order, just like I asked, because you all are so good and so respectful of that. The eagle has a triplet format, and you can see the last 3 lines, the first 3 lines, hands, lands, and stands, and then the last 3, crawls, walls, and falls. Now, I had never read this poem before, but I loved it. I hope you guys enjoyed it too. So the eagle. He clasps the crag with crooked hands, close to the sun in lonely lands, ringed with the azure world he stands. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls, he watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt he falls. Enclosed rhyme is another example of rhyme scheme, and in this one you usually have 4 lines per stanza, and the ending rhyming words go A, B, B, A. And I want to show you an example of why this is kind of an interesting way to do something and how it can change the rhyme scheme or the meter or the feel of the poem. So I asked Charlie to write me just a super short 4-line poem using couplets. So here's what Charlie wrote in about 10 seconds. There once was a cat named Jack. His fur was charcoal black. He loved to go outside, but in the car he would not ride. Now this is an AABB, right? This is our couplet. If I were to rearrange Charlie's line and give it an ABBA rhythm, the poem has a very different feel to it. The first one is kind of very sing-song, and it goes along, and it feels like just kind of a fun poem to read, right? You probably smiled at the end. When I read it this way, I want to see if you have a different feel. There once was a cat named Jack. He loved to go outside, but in the car he would not ride. His fur was charcoal black. For some reason, when you use that enclosed rhyme, it almost has a less playful feel to it and sounds a little more dramatic. And I'm not sure why that is, but I'll be curious to see if anyone else thought that too. So I think of enclosed rhymes as sometimes being used when a poem is more, maybe a little more somber, or just they're really trying to have a different emphasis to the poem. And I think it also makes the reader slow down, or the person reciting slow down, because you can't get into quite the same easy rhythm as when every 2 lines are rhyming together. The last one I wanted to talk about is limerick. And guys, there are many more rhyme schemes. There are many more that are much more complex than these and are a lot of fun to play with. And maybe if we have a chance, we'll play around with some of those next week. But the limerick is one that you've probably heard before. And it uses 5 lines, and the rhythm is very structured with the AA, BB, A. So that means your first, second, and fifth lines rhyme. The third and fourth also rhyme. For some reason in our family, we love to write limericks. I should have thought to bring some of the ones that we've written, but they are a little trickier than you'd expect. So I would encourage you to try to play around with this if you like to do poetry. Here's an example of a very famous limerick that was written by Edward Lear, and this is just kind of a fun one. There was an old man with a beard who said, "It is just as I feared. 2 owls and a hen, 4 larks and a wren have all built their nests in my beard." Typically, limericks as well are also going to have a little more structure in how many syllables they have in each line, and they're going to be much more similar in the first, second, and fifth lines Those are also typically longer, and then your lines 3 and 4 are usually shorter rhyming lines. Here's another limerick, a famous one from Othello by William Shakespeare, so I had to, of course, include this for Mrs. Krivak. And let me the cannikin clink, clink, and let me the cannikin clink. A soldier's a man, a life's but a span. Why then, let a soldier drink. All right, so I hope you kind of are enjoying just sort of seeing the different ways that poems rhyme and maybe understanding a little more as you read them what the author is doing. For the sake of tying in our history, I found a poem that we could share here that's called The Transcontinental Railroad. And it was not written by anyone famous. This was actually written by a middle school student, but I thought it was kind of a fun one. And you can see how sometimes rhyme schemes may be even a little more complex. So I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to show you an example of how you would go through and identify what rhyme scheme this person is using. So the Transcontinental Railroad. They started in the east, laying down the rails, and out in California they were blazing out a trail. Toward the center they did strive, no one knew when they would arrive, building the Transcontinental Railroad. They cleared the way and blasted through the mountainside, and built big trestle bridges stretching over valleys wide. And it's a fact they laid more than 3,000 miles of track to build the Transcontinental Railroad. It took 6 years, and in the spring of 1869, in Promontory, Utah, they connected the two lines. And across this growing nation, folks joined in the celebration of the Transcontinental Railroad. So some great poetic devices in there too. I hope you could really image. They cleared the way and blasted the mountainside, the big trestle bridges stretching over the valleys. Also, we could see a little bit in there too, right, with blasted being like an onomatopoeia word. Okay, let's take a look though now at the rhyme scheme. So if we look at the first two lines, rails and trails, we can see that those are our AA. We then move on to strive and arrive. That's another rhyming couplet, but they're a different word than rails and trails, so that's BB. Building the Transcontinental Railroad rhymes with nothing that we've already used, so this is C. Now we look at our next stanza here. They cleared the way and blasted through the mountainside. The valley's wide, so we have a new rhyming couplet, D and D. Now this one is really interesting, and this to me is kind of the odd one in the poem. And it's a fact they laid more than 3,000 miles of track, but then nothing is there to rhyme with it. So technically I need to mark this as an E, and then we go back to build the Transcontinental Railroad, which is C. It's matching the line before. It's almost acting as a refrain, like if you were singing this as a song. Right? So that would be kind of like the repeated refrain, but it's the same as the end of the first verse, or the first stanza, excuse me. Now for this E line, I will point out, I'm not sure if the person was trying to do this or not, but they do sort of have a couplet embedded in this line when they say, and it's a fact, they laid more than 3,000 miles of track. So there is a little bit of a repeated vowel sound in there, that consonant that we talked about a few slides ago, consonants. So it's possible that maybe they're trying to make the connection there. But it is a little bit different than the first and last stanza. So if we look at the last stanza, we again go back to identifying our rhyming words, 69 and the lines. Those are words that are rhyming in a couplet, but not ones we've used before. So those are F. Then we have nation and celebration. There's another rhyming couplet, G. And then there's our refrain of the Transcontinental Railroad, as long as I can keep reading to you. There we go. So 3 refrains, 3 stanzas, and that refrain, you notice, even though it's not really rhyming with anything else, really pulls the poem together and kind of almost brings you back to this sense of closure at the end of every stanza. So there's really a nice rhythm built in throughout this poem that you see as you move from stanza to stanza. Okay, I hope you have kind of enjoyed the lesson today. I am going to give you what was step 6 in your email and give you a chance to do something on your own. Okay, so here's your turn. This is a photo of someone I actually know in person. His name is George Moss, and we worked together a long time ago in Grand Rapids. He was just beginning his musical career as a budding artist, and he was invited to play and open up some shows for some pretty big Christian artists. He is a Christian rapper, and one of the things that he does very well is write lyrics. And I want to just encourage you guys, as you probably saw in my step 6, to go in and listen to his song that I put in at that link. And now that you hear the lyrics and you can see the words, I would love for you to just try to look at that and see how it connects to poetry. and how music really can be very poetic in lots of different forms. You'll also remember that step 6, which was something I asked you to wait on until after you watch this PowerPoint, gives you a chance to see if you want to try to find a poem or a song that you really like. Take a look at the words, the lyrics, print it out, and then see if you can go through and identify the kind of rhyme scheme that the author or artist is using. Okay, so I hope you'll enjoy that assignment. Next week, I will send another video and we will talk about poetry, and we will focus more on free verse, which is usually the non-rhyming format of poetry, and we'll get a chance to explore some poems there as well. So until I see you Thursday, have a good rest of your week.